Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name is Tanner, and I'll be joined as usual by Taylor. Taylor, how's it going?
It is pretty good doing this on a Monday night this week. So that's a little different, but cool.
Yeah, it's a change up. This is going to be part 3 of a multi-part series on the Spanish Armada of 1588, so we do suggest going back and listening to parts 1 and 2 if you haven't already done so. Part 1 deals with the background, context in which the Armada was launched. Part 2 covers the opening stages of the campaign, between the time the Armada leaves Lisbon at the end of May and the opening engagement with the English fleet off of Plymouth on July 31st. So before we jump in, gotta do our normal shtick here. What have you been up to media-wise? What have you been doing?
Even more King of the Hill. I've kind of got obsessed with that. It's just such a fun show. We were kind of talking before we started recording how it's such like a pre-9/11 show.
Mm-hmm.
In that, like, not everything, even the political stuff, isn't colored politically. It's weird.
Right.
It's kind of refreshing that it's like most of it's like maybe just be a good person.
One of my favorite parts is the talking about shaking hands with George Bush. Mm-hmm. And a character now, it would be totally normal to play them as not liking George Bush, but for very different reasons. And Hank doesn't like him because he has a weak handshake. I love that show.
Yeah. What about you, though? What have you been doing?
Katie and I, we got up to Door County for a very quick visit.
Nice. I saw some of those pictures. It looked nice.
This weekend. And yeah, it was fun. The parents were up there doing a half marathon in Door County at that Peninsula State Park. Lovely state park up there. And so we just went up for, we spent one night. So we got to see them. We hung out, watched some baseball the first night. Katie and I went to our favorite bookstore, the Peninsula Bookman in Fish Creek. Lovely place. Seems like we were just there. We still managed to find plenty of stuff that we didn't grab the last time around.
Nice.
Found a cool book about steamboats.
Did you take the company card with you on that?
No, I guess I forgot about that. I could have. I would have needed to do separate transactions, I guess. It's called The Steamboaters, From the Early Sidewheelers to the Big Packets by Harry Sinclair Drago? Maybe he's Yvonne's brother. Imperial Spain, 1469 to 1716 by J.H. Eliot. It's one of the older Penguin history ones. I love the way that those look on the shelf. A book about the Duke of Alba. Kind of close in time to what we're talking about here. Before the Duke of Parma was in the army of Flanders, there was Don Juan, the half-brother of Philip. And before him was the Duke of Alba. And then the pièce de résistance is a book called Tin Stackers, The History of the Pittsburgh Steamship Company.
Huh, that one sounds really cool.
By Al Miller. It's got a nice picture of the Arthur M. Anderson on the cover.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty good book haul.
So, we've got some work to do today.
Yeah, looks like it.
We are into part 3 of the Armada. This has a spoiler in the title. It's called The Defeat of the Spanish Armada, is the name of the episode. And just as a quick recap here, just to get everyone up to speed, at the end of our last episode, we had talked about that initial engagement off of Plymouth that resulted in the loss of 2 Spanish vessels.
Mm-hmm.
Neither of those actually coming at the hands of English gunnery. Those exchanges of fire resulted in some minimal damage on both sides, and the Armada had pushed on pretty much undeterred, except maybe in the area of morale. So in regard to Pedro de Valdez and the Rosario being abandoned to the English, Neil Hanson quotes one Spanish officer as saying,
"These misfortunes presaged our failure. The vile omen depressed the whole Armada."
In the previous 2 parts, we've discussed the challenges inherent in the Spanish plan to execute a rendezvous at sea between Medina Sidonia's Armada and the invasion force from Dunkirk led by the Duke of Parma. There's never really a great place to throw this in, but it hasn't come up yet. Just a little side detail. The Duke of Parma is Philip's nephew, by the way.
Okay.
It's not hugely important because, like, everyone's sort of related to everybody.
And everyone's like a duke of something or an earl of something?
everyone's sort of related, and it doesn't really mean much about the closeness of their relationship. So one of the challenges to that plan is the issue of communication and timing. That's not to say that communication was impossible, though. There had been attempts at this.
Yeah, this is really interesting because, like we were kind of talking about last week, this feels like a very modern and logistically complex operation. You know, he's literally doing Operation Sea Lion.
Yeah, it's like, and you need some quick communication to make sure everyone's clear on everything here. So on the 25th of July, so when the Armada was still pushing north across the Bay of Biscay, Medina Sidonia had sent a message to Parma, informing him of the Armada's progress. But by the time of that first engagement off Plymouth, there hadn't been any response from Parma, which just time-wise would have been possible. So that prompted Medina Sidonia to send a second pinnace to Dunkirk with a further update on the now much closer location of the Armada. And the purpose of that was two things. It was to inform Parma of their progress, but also to, inquire about Parma's invasion force, see how are things going over there. Because Parma is likely going to need several days to get things ready once the arrival of the Armada is imminent. We'll see Medina Sidonia get increasingly desperate to hear something back from Parma because, that's, like we said, a really super key part of the plan.
Right.
Another decision made here by Medina Sidonia at this point is to make a change to the rendezvous point. Philip's plan called for the link-up to happen just off the English coast at Margate, so this is in Kent. Instead, the Duke decided to wait on the other side of the channel off of Calais in some waters that would be quite a bit closer to Parma's departure point and also further away from the English. That allows the meeting to happen more quickly, and it leaves Parma's invasion force exposed for a shorter amount of time. Because, of course, the Armada with these big galleons, they can't actually get in very close to Dunkirk because of the shoals, the banks of Flanders. They don't have pilots that can navigate through them. Mm-hmm. And even if they did, there's places where they just can't get these ships. There's going to be a natural amount of time when Parma's force is sailing unprotected and exposed. Now, exposed to what, you might ask? So while the Spanish Armada was dealing with the English fleet, kind of nipping at their heels, there's another naval force in the story that, even in the total absence of the threat from England, it may well have defanged Parma's invasion anyway. And this was the Dutch sea beggars under Justin of Nassau. They're always side characters in the Armada story. Any of the multiple books, any of the depictions you read, they're always just the supporting cast.
It's like the other people at the Thermopylae that weren't the Spartans.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great comparison. Is, of course, there's other people there that are integral to this plan. They might actually be the most important factor in Spain being unable to invade England. So although Spain held the port of Dunkirk, among others, their ability to use it was always pretty badly hindered by this near blockade imposed on them by the Dutch naval forces. When Parma captured Dunkirk in 1583, he set about making a navy to sweep the Dutch from the North Sea. Quoting here from Geoffrey Parker in The Army of Flanders and the Spanish Road.
Thus began the Flanders fleet, which for the rest of the war operated against the Dutch, capturing prizes, protecting Spanish merchantmen, and ferrying troops between Spain and South Netherlands. Yet the activities of the Dunkirk fleet did not win the war. In the words of a Spanish minister in 1601, if we bring out 100 ships, they bring out 400. And if more. And they are always happy to lose 10 of their ships if they can sink one of ours.
So when the Armada gets closer to Dunkirk, we'll see kind of the final nail in the coffin of the rendezvous plan. But also, that talking about the fact that the Spanish effectively can't use the naval approaches to the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons why, that book is called The Army of Flanders and the Spanish Road. The Spanish Road is, it's a road used by the Spanish, and it runs from northern Italy, and it kind of hops from Spanish possession to Spanish possession northwest to the Netherlands. And so the reason that it made more sense for Spain to march its troops from Italy all the way to the Netherlands when they could just put them on a boat is this. It's way too risky to be transporting large numbers of troops because of the pirates, you might call them if you're Spanish.
It's always subjective, I suppose, right?
So for now, we'll go back to the south coast of England, where the English fleet is re-engaging with the Spanish off of Portland on August 2nd. So Martin and Parker will set the scene for us.
As dawn broke on the Tuesday, a fresh breeze sprang up from the east to give the Spaniards for the first time the weather gauge. Responding to the danger, Lord Admiral Howard led his galleons, close-hauled, towards the north-northeast, attempting to place himself between the Armada and the land. But Medina Sidonia used his advantage of wind to counter this attempt, forcing the English ships to come about in a reach towards the south-southwest.
Notice how anytime they talk about like actual maneuvers and the weather gauge, I use a direct quote because I have no idea what they're talking about, and I'm not confident enough to paraphrase it. So at this point, we get kind of two parallel fights going on in the vicinity of Portland Bill. It's like this little island thing that sticks off the coast of England. So there's this kind of general melee that lasts for about 2 hours with Spanish vessels trying to bear down on English ships, only for the English to stay clear and just keep on pumping cannonballs into them. And then just west of Portland, 6 of the English vessels found themselves isolated from the main body and too far inshore to effectively navigate. 5 of these were armed merchantmen from the London squadron, and the 6th was Martin Frobisher's Triumph. Triumph was the largest vessel in the English fleet and one of the largest in either fleets at 1,100 tons. Also one of the heaviest armed with 40 guns. In Martin and Parker, they analyzed some of the measurements used by each fleet and how, this is before things are totally standardized.
Right.
And Martin and Parker suggest that Triumph may have actually been the largest vessel in either fleet. With only 4 Spanish vessels even appearing on paper to be larger.
That is interesting. Yeah, there's not that standardization there.
Just the way that a Spanish ton was measured against an English ton. It's not totally clear here. Also, something I forgot to add to the notes here, but I'll add it in as best I can. In discussions of the Armada, you often get this image of big lumbering Spanish galleons against small English ships darting in and out and just kind of picking them apart. And there's elements of that are true, but not so much because of the overall size. It has more to do with the profile. We had talked about, the big high windage Spanish galleons. And a lot of the English vessels, really under the direction of John Hawkins, he had kind of been the proponent of this, had actually been cut down. Their fore and their stern castles had been effectively just cut off of them to lower the profile of the ship, give them better maneuverability. And it also affects, where they can put their guns because you don't have this super high center of gravity to deal with. And the Triumph was still in kind of the older galleon style. So the Triumph, by comparison to the other English ships, would have been this big lumbering behemoth.
Right.
But still was able to maneuver quite a bit better than the Spanish vessels. The term for that you'll see in the writing is race built for these lower, sleeker ships. And interestingly enough, the etymology of race built has nothing to do with racing.
Really? That's surprising.
It comes from the word raise, like to raise a building, to bring it down.
Interesting.
And so a lot of the English vessels were like this. They had maybe formerly been your more traditional galleon style. They'd been cut down to some effectiveness, as we'll see here coming up.
Interesting.
So that's kind of where that idea comes from of, these English ships are by no means tiny compared to the Spanish. They're often a lot lower, though, at their highest point. Medina Sidonia, so seeing this juicy, tempting, lovely target, the Triumph, if he can damage or sink or capture the Triumph, this is a massive coup in his favor. Seeing this sitting here seemingly helpless is a big temptation.
Right.
This is also not a chance that the Spanish are getting very often. The English are very good with their ships. They're not really making these mistakes. So Medina Sidonia, trying to take advantage, he sends in the squadron of 4 galleasses to attack them. And I think that really highlights the esteem that these galleasses are held in. Sending in 4 against 6, one of those 6 being the most formidable vessel the English have, really says a lot about what they think the galleasses can do.
You definitely have to have some level of confidence at that point, I would think.
So if you're thinking that this development sounds a little bit too good to be true for the Spanish, you just might be correct. Based on what happens next, it seems like this was probably a trap.
I was going to say, this does almost feel like, when you get him to chase like one person straight into an ambush.
And it's like, so Martin Frobisher, one of the most famous captains in the world, accidentally sailed too close in waters that he knows about as well as anyone.
Okay. Right.
Because what happens as these galleasses are coming in, the attack falters and they make really, really slow progress because they're probably caught in the tides between Portland Bill and the Shambles. It's a sandbank. And of course, Frobisher knows that this is going to happen. And this is why they think this is a unintentional thing that he did. We talked about the advantage of galleasses having the option of oar power in the last episode. They're not as reliant on the wind. They don't need it necessarily. Like everything with upsides, there's a downside. For the galleasses, this is the exposure of the rowing banks to concentrated gunfire.
Well, that doesn't sound good.
Yeah, so if you have all your people here and the other ship knows that that's where your people are and you need them to move, very easy to target those people.
Yeah, I feel like that's something that was taken care of back in like the Roman days.
Let's see. So with Frobisher directing that heavy fire at the rowing banks, the galleasses are actually forced back into using sail power, where they're just a lot less maneuverable. So if that was planned, then Frobisher did his job pretty perfectly, because Lord Howard peels off from the main English body. They're fighting with the Spanish rearguard to come and take on those galleasses. Even if this was unplanned, let's say this was an actual
mistake,
something that Frobisher, actually did mess up here. If that's the case, then this shows some pretty quick decision making on Howard's part. If he sees this and he can quickly take advantage of it.
Yeah, I think that sometimes like great people, we think that they never make mistakes. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of times like the really smart and remembered, generals or admirals, it's not that they don't make a mistake. It's just they realize it a lot quicker or a way out of it a lot better than someone else.
It reminds me of something from the Age of Napoleon podcast. And it's one of the recent ones. I forget which battle he was talking about. It might have been Jena or one of those. And how Napoleon, one of those figures, time everyone knows that he's this military genius, and that esteem that he's held in prevents people from jumping on it when he does actually legitimately make a mistake, because they see this division, this whatever, exposed, and they think that's bait. There's no way I'm jumping on that because I know that there's no way he actually made a mistake.
Right.
If that's the case, then Howard just made a very quick decision here. Also, around this time, it's possible that this is the first line ahead style attack, like you see from the Age of Sail, ships sailing one after another, firing their broadsides. This is possibly one of the first times that ever happens.
Interesting. So we're seeing like that evolution of tactic.
With the Mary Rose, we saw this is one of the first ships that could fire a legitimate broadside. And now we see the development of another tactic we're going to see more later in the Age of Sail. Despite all of the fire being exchanged, in both of those fights, neither side really damages the other at all. The exchanges do provide some insight, though, into the advantage that's enjoyed by the English, and that's their rate of fire and their ability to concentrate guns on target.
I feel like they just do everything better.
Pretty much everything involving the sea, yeah, you could say that they're more accustomed to doing this. An officer aboard the Spanish flagship San Martin, so this is Medina Sidonia's vessel, he estimated that for the 80 shots they got off during this fight, she took about 500 in return.
Gee.
She was apparently surrounded by so much smoke that she couldn't be seen by the other Spanish vessels for as much as an hour. But again, as we said, those 500 shots don't really do a lot to her.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of like the Monitor and the Virginia. Like where they both go out and realize like neither one can sink the other one, basically.
In developing these ironclads, no one thought about the other side of the equation. So again, despite this, quote, terrible value of great shot, the Armada just keeps on rolling. So after that second engagement with the Spanish fleet, the English still haven't managed to sink or capture a Spanish vessel through their own strength of arms. At this point, there's still about 120 ships advancing eastward through the channel towards the Isle of Wight.
That's a few more than you hope for if you were the English.
Yeah, and really that highlights the English basically can't afford a draw here, they need to significantly damage or weaken the Armada, and they're not doing it. So at this point, it's like on the English side, maybe some panic is starting to set in for some of these people. So on the evening of August 2nd, as the Armada is approaching the Isle of Wight, throughout these notes, I have Parma talking to Parma because the first one's supposed to be Medina Sidonia. There's too many dukes here.
I hate when that happens.
Nobility is stupid. This is the one good thing about America. On the evening of August 2nd, as the Armada was approaching the Isle of Wight, Medina Sidonia is getting increasingly stressed at the lack of response from Parma. So we mentioned the dangers of arriving before Parma was prepared to leave. The Isle of Wight's a pretty major checkpoint in this process. Without having any word from Parma that he was ready to go or getting ready to go, Medina Sidonia really doesn't want to go past the Isle of Wight.
That makes sense.
Because with that prevailing westerly wind, there's really no turning back after that. You can't just stop and decide to wait again. You're making the final descent into Dunkirk here. Medina Sidonia considered putting into anchorage at Portsmouth to wait things out, since that would have been a safe and defensible spot for the Armada. However, the English are pretty savvy to this plan also. They realize that's probably what he's going to want to do, shelter in the Solent, which, as a reminder, that's the body of water that separates the Isle of Wight from Great Britain, and Portsmouth is at the eastern entrance. This is extremely close to where the Mary Rose went down.
Yeah, I thought that was a pretty interesting area geographically when I was looking at it. It's not somewhere I'd been familiar with before the Mary Rose, but it's very interesting.
And there's some interesting stuff around this with Philip. Philip had mentioned the Solent as a possible emergency anchorage as needed. And he had given some advice saying, oh, you should go in this way versus this way because there's more space here for your ships. And an example of how Philip sometimes knew just enough to get himself in trouble, because the Solent is a pretty tricky body of water where the width doesn't necessarily correlate with the navigability. There's a lot of shallows and stuff in there that aren't quite apparent just looking at a map.
Right.
This is about the time that Lord Howard makes a tactical change to the deployment of the English fleet. Up to this point, they've kind of just been this undifferentiated mass, just kind of grouping together as needed. You know, maybe one of the captains wants to do something, he grabs a few ships and they go do it.
It almost seems like the English are trying to figure out where the Spanish are going to really make their push. So it's almost like probing it a little bit to be where can we draw you in it? And then you kind of capitalize on that.
You're talking about the English kind of probing and prodding and seeing what they can do. This is where that intelligence from the end of the last episode comes in, because it seems after some of these things we'll see, quite possible Drake and the other captains are kind of building their case for what kind of fight they want to get into.
Right.
Because they've seen the guns on the Rosario, and they've seen that these guns are totally inadequate for any kind of close quarters gun battle. They're not going to be able to reload these things in combat. They probably don't have the guys trained to do that anyway. So let's see what we can do here. Let's keep probing and prodding just to kind of make sure this holds true for all these other ships. So Howard decides to split the fleet into 4 squadrons. He'd be in command of one personally, with Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher in command of the others. Also, not to totally cut this guy out of the story, Lord Seymour, kind of this whole time, he has been in the narrow sea between England and the Netherlands. He's kind of been there in command of that squadron this whole time, sitting in the background. So he is over there, but he's not part of this just yet. On the night of August 3rd into the morning of the 4th, so while Hawkins and Howard targeted vessels that were kind of lagging behind the main Spanish fleet, Frobisher took his squadron to block the eastern entrance to the Solent. They do not want the Spanish to get in here because they'll be very hard to attack. Medina Sidonia led some galleons to engage Frobisher and clear the entrance, and in standard English fashion here, Frobisher's vessels scattered away from this direct confrontation.
Yeah, that is so interesting. It's make contact and move. They don't want to stand and fight necessarily.
The main goal is just to break the Armada somehow. As long as they stay together in this big mass, they're pretty much invincible to any level of English gunnery. So we've accounted for Hawkins and Howard and Frobisher. Are we forgetting someone?
Uh-oh.
The Spanish left and rear engaged. The right wing suddenly came under attack from the seaward direction. Medina Sidonia, with his powerful force of galleons, now has to peel back around to defend against this new threat. A Spanish officer described the attack being conducted
in such wise that we who were there were cornered, so that if the Duke had not gone about his flagship, we should have come out vanquished that day.
So it's not 100% verified. A lot of these type things weren't written down, but it's pretty apparent that this critical attack was led by Drake.
It's like when the Undertaker's music just comes on.
Right, it's like that's Drake's music.
That's Drake's music.
The timing, the effectiveness, coupled with the fact that Drake isn't mentioned in the earlier events here, it kind of indicates that he had worked his way out to seawards, planning this exact strike. Classic Drake here.
What's that scene in Lord of the Rings? Where there's like the big friendly cavalry charge.
The Riders of Rohan. Yeah.
Drake's that.
So again, we've got a lot of shots being exchanged with very little damage and no English ships venturing close enough to be grappled and boarded. So as frustrated as the English are, the Spanish are equally, if not more, frustrated because they really can't do the thing that they want to do.
Yeah, I do. Like, it's interesting that I feel like the English, it's like watching Manny Pacquiao box. It's just kind of hunting and pecking.
I would compare this to, in Game of Thrones, the fight between the Viper of Dorne and Rhaegar Clegane, the mountain that rides. They fight a duel, one of the most famous scenes in the books and the TV show. The TV show scene is a very tough watch if you don't like things happening to people's eyes. But anyway, the idea, the Viper, he is just darting in and out. He's kind of just like causing these tiny little wounds. And like everyone knows that, hey, if the mountain catches hold of him, he's going to crush him to death between his mighty fists. And it's just that, like, he just cannot get hold of him until he does. It's the same type of situation. So the English here are pretty desperate for resupply. They're running low on all of the things they need to fire cannons. So they break off contact. And this would actually give the Armada 3 days of relief as they just continued their progress eastward. So the Armada crossed the channel and anchored off of Calais in the late afternoon of August 6th. Calais is only about 25 miles from Dunkirk, where Parma would ideally be waiting with the army of Flanders all ready to go.
I'm just kind of thinking as you're like saying all these names of places like Calais and Dunkirk and Flanders, how much war has gone on in these places?
Mm-hmm.
Like, forever.
Yeah, centuries of it. Yeah, I mean, Dunkirk is interesting for most people now. There's the immediate association with like the Dunkirk evacuation. But also in like the early modern period, Dunkirk is like a famous pirate haven or privateer haven. Yeah, so it's, the Dunkirk pirates are a significant factor in a lot of the stuff going on in the Channel and the North Sea. This leads us to the question, maybe the same question that Medina Sidonia asked himself. What has Parma been doing this whole time? What is he up to?
Yeah, what is he up to? Where is he?
So we've mentioned Medina Sidonia's attempts to contact him. On the 25th of July, he sent a letter with the progress update as they crossed the Bay of Biscay. No response. On the 31st, off of Plymouth, another message. This was a progress report and a request for pilots who could help to navigate those shoals off the coast of Flanders. He's just begging for some Flemings here.
I feel like it's sort of late in the game to be being like, by the way, we could use some people that can navigate the ships.
Forgot my pilots. On August 5th, so this is the day before they reach Calais, he sent another one explaining the reason for their delays and begging for reinforcements and resupply.
I have constantly written to you, Your Excellency, and not only have I received no reply to my letters, but no acknowledgement of their receipt.
Medina Sidonia, he's not even being left on red here. He's not even seeing that this has been delivered. The messenger from the 31st of July, he arrived early in the day on August 6th. The same day that the main fleet reached Calais. The next messenger had been sent. He arrived later that day on the 6th. And by that point, the Armada was itself at Calais. effectively within rendezvous range, and Parma had literally just found out that they were even anywhere close. So yeah, the messengers didn't work the way that they thought they would. Finally, in the late evening of August 6th, a messenger arrives from Parma to the anchored Armada. Parma said that his men would be ready in 6 days.
Why? Why so long?
This is a worst case scenario for Medina Sidonia. Because again, like Parma had no idea that they were even close. It says, yeah, like I can get my guys ready in 6 days. Terrible, awful, worst case scenario for Medina Sidonia. So we've been pretty sympathetic to Medina Sidonia up to this point. But here we see why at least some of the blame does tend to fall onto the Duke. We also get to see some of the action happening off stage here. Or backstage. I don't know what the metaphor would be. Before the Armada sailed, Medina Sidonia had been briefed by an officer from the Army of Flanders on the forces available for the invasion and what they'd need from him to execute this invasion. Parma was concerned about his lack of escort vessels available. Philip had kind of just brushed that aside, assuring him that the Armada would clear the narrow seas before Parma crossed the channel. And Medina Sidonia might not have entirely understood his part in this plan. The first message he sent to Parma on June 10th, this is as the Armada is still approaching Cape Finisterre, so they haven't even hit that storm off of Corunna. In this message, he told Parma that he would write again as soon as he got closer to coordinate when Parma would, quote, come out and join us. Parma reads this and, I'm assuming, does a bit of a double take. He fires off an angry note to Philip, saying,
Medina seems to believe that I should set out to meet him with my small ships, which is simply impossible. These vessels cannot run the gauntlet of warships. They cannot even withstand large waves.
So Parma knows what he's got here. We mentioned how Philip, a lot of his correspondence, he has left his margin notes and comments on it. His margin note on this letter, Philip wrote, quote, please God, let there not be some slip up here.
I just feel like that's like a rare, like relatable moment to someone in history. Like we've all had that thought in a project or at work or in something like, oh God, please no.
You're just like hoping at the chance that maybe this will go right.
It's like, remember in school when you'd be waiting and the teacher, like it was like college or something. So like you could leave like early if there were no more questions. And like there'd always be that kid who was way too into it. Like have like a 20-minute conversation. It's that.
So for various reasons, no messenger had been able to reach Medina Sidonia with that clarification. Parma had been sending people to him, but they just had not gotten to him. So with both those dastardly Dutch sea beggars to worry about and the English fleet still out in the channel, absolutely no way that Parma can set sail. As he said, these things barely float under no stress.
Right.
Certainly not taking them through a war zone. So the Spanish fleet at anchor attracted the attention of not just the English ships, but spectators as well. The governor of Calais, Giraud de Moléon, wrote,
Flemings, Walloons, and Frenchmen came thick and threefold to behold it, admiring the exceeding greatness of the ships and their warlike order.
Flemings, Walloons, and Frenchmen, Batman. The English also lined the cliffs of Dover, trying to get a vantage point on the action. There is some mustering going on ashore in England that we'll talk about probably in the bonus episode. We'll get into that. What are the English doing if the Spanish do land? What's the plan there? We'll talk about that in the bonus. So the governor of Calais, he also offered the Spanish a chance to resupply, although not as a gift. They were paying for all this stuff.
Interesting.
Because the French were still technically neutral, and the governor was nice enough to them personally, but he also wanted nothing to do with, getting involved with anything here.
Right.
A Spanish provisioning party went ashore with 6,000 ducats to buy whatever was available. And they basically just ate and drank this whole region dry, just buying whatever they could, which is still not enough for everyone. So what they do get is going to the officers, the gentlemen, the commanders, common sailors and soldiers. They're still surviving on probably not very much and not very good rations at this point.
Awesome.
A lot of them are starting to go bad. They're rotting. One of the kind of underlying questions of like, why did the Spanish have so much trouble with their rations? Because like the Spanish, they were making transatlantic voyages. They knew how to outfit a ship for a long voyage.
Right.
A lot of the suspicion falls on the Portuguese people that would have been probably packing a lot of the provisions, saying, do they really have a lot of incentive to do this right? and there may have been some light sabotage there, but there's no real way to prove that. So Parma sent a message. I did it again. Medina Sidonia sent a message to Parma with more details on his position.
I am anchored here 2 leagues from Calais, with the enemy's fleet on my flank. They can cannonade me whenever they like, and I shall be unable to do them much harm. If you can send me 40 or 50 flyboats of your fleet, I can, with their help, defend myself here until you are ready to come out.
So this yet again shows some fatal misunderstanding on Medina Sidonia's part of what the Duke of Parma actually has available.
40 to 50 boats seems like a lot. I don't care how big they are. That seems like a lot.
And it's a very casual request. It's like, hey, just send me 40 or 50 of these. The boats that Medina Sidonia is requesting just don't exist. So on the topic of flyboats, Garrett Mattingly has this to say in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Armada.
Flyboats were those fast, shallow draft little ships of war with which, in the early days of the revolt of the Netherlands, the sea beggars had terrorized the Channel, and with which ever since the Dutch had commanded their coastal waters. Flyboats were just what Parma lacked. So far as being able to send 40 or 50 to reinforce the Armada, he could scarcely have sent a dozen, even if no one had tried to prevent him.
So while the Armada lay at anchor off Calais, the English were resupplying their ships and planning their next move. With the Spanish vessels closely packed at anchor, not far from the dangerous Flemish shoals, pretty clear choice here for the English. Fireships. So Drake was the first one to offer up one of his ships, the Thomas, for this task. Hawkins donated 7 to this endeavor. You might wonder, why are these captains volunteering their ships? The answer, like most things, is money. They got paid for these ships. And kind of like a good insurance scheme, if you can get paid for setting a ship on fire, you're going to do it.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, one of your older ships, you're not going to do much with it. Yeah, let's light her up. So it's noted by Neil Hanson that the ships used were much heavier than was typical for a fire ship. So in the hope of foiling any attempts by the Spanish to tow them off course. That was kind of the standard defense against a fire ship, was to send out your small boats, grapple it, and pull it aside, which sounds like a terrible job.
I would not want to be on the small boat.
So a Captain Prowse and John Young were the 2 Englishmen tasked with the preparation of the ships.
All the sails, spars, and riggings were kept in place, for the fire ships would be sent downwind under full sail. Nor were the guns removed. Instead, they were double-shotted and loaded to the mouth with bullets, old iron, and every sort of destructive implement that could be collected, in the hope that their detonations, as the flames reached them, would create fresh panic and damage within the Armada.
Prowse and Young dressed them with a wildfire, pitch, and resin, and filled them full of brimstone and some other matter fit for fire. Everything from the masts and rigging to the deck timbers and rails was coated with pitch, and tar barrels were also lashed to the bows.
12 men were detailed to crew each fire ship, hauling the sails, holding them to their course, and at the last minute, as they approached the Armada's defensive screen, igniting fires to engulf them.
So the possibility of a fire ship attack wasn't a surprise to the Spanish. It wasn't unforeseen by any means. Fire ships had been deployed against Parma's forces in the Netherlands in 1585. And in that case, they'd been used to destroy a bridge across the Scheldt River. And I want to talk about this attack just because it's fascinating. It's not really relevant to the Armada. It was devised by the Italian engineer Federico Giambelli. And so what they did here, they sent in 2 decoy ships first that were just easily steered aside. This is like in Escape from Alcatraz when he goes through the metal detector. And it's like very easy to, what are you doing here? Just deals with it. So while that was happening, 2 more vessels loaded with about 7,000 pounds of gunpowder each, and then, of course, all of your metal scraps and whatever, they were sent against the bridge. So the Spanish were pretty easily able to jump on board, cut the fuses on deck, effectively disarming the explosives. And that's what happens on a normal fire ship. In this case, it wasn't actually the fuses that were going to set off the gunpowder. You know how the Dutch are like famous for making clocks?
Yeah, that is something I think they're noted for.
So in the hold, there were some rigged up clock-operated flintlocks that were designed by a Dutch watchmaker. And so that's what was going to set off these fuses. And so they built 2 big floating time bombs. So the subsequent explosion killed about 800 Spaniards. It even apparently knocked the Duke of Parma to the ground. And left a pretty vivid memory for any Spanish who were there to carry with them into subsequent engagements.
That feels so modern.
Yeah, I didn't know that there was going to be a time bomb in the story.
They did like the Pan Am Lockerbie bombing, but...
Well, it reminded me of the Viribus Unitas when the 2 Italian frogmen are captured and brought on board, and they think that the danger is past, and they're like, no, it's still going to explode.
Yeah.
So in the case of the Armada, there were some precautions taken in the event, more of Jambelli's hell burners were deployed. So they set a screen of pinnaces and boats ready to grapple those incoming fireships and tow them aside. Commanders are also instructed to be prepared to slip and buoy their cables in the event that the screen failed. If they needed to cut and run quickly, they could slip those, leave a buoy with them, and then come back and get them later. I guess provided that the other guys play nice and don't mess with your buoys. So quoting here again from Mattingly.
Until about midnight, nothing happened except that the freshening of the southern wind and the flying scud across the moon gave promise of a blustery morning. Then lights appeared at the edge of the English fleet.
Not lights. Fires. 2, 6, 8 of them moving forward rapidly and growing in brilliance until the watchers at the Spanish anchorage could see plainly 8 tall ships with all sails set and lines of fire beginning to run up their rigging, driving straight towards them with wind and tide.
The fireships seemed to maintain a perfect line, and to keep so close together that 2 pikemen on adjacent ships, if men could have lived on those blazing decks, could have leaned out and clashed their pike heads above the intervening water.
So the fireships at each end were successfully towed aside, but as that's happening, all those overloaded guns start to go off, and that sounds awful. And this scatters that screen of vessels, because you've got these burning ships coming in, their cannons are going off.
I would assume there's some confusion too of why is the fire ship shooting its cannon at me?
That was a tactic that they may have been familiar with. And then again, think about these guns are intentionally overcharged, overloaded. The guns are probably rupturing and exploding also. All kinds of terrible stuff going on here. With those screen vessels scattering, that leaves the way open to the main body of the Armada. This is the one thing we didn't want to happen. So naturally, those Armada ships, which had been preparing to flee just such an attack, they start to scatter and try to head out to sea. But rather than the more measured slipping and buoying of the anchors, a really significant number of the Spanish vessels just cut their cables. So by Neil Hanson's calculation,
since almost all of the Armada ships had at least 2 anchors out to hold them in the shifting sands against the pull of the currents, as many as 200 may still lie resting in the mud beneath the Calais cliffs.
So some of the Spanish vessels are able to keep their composure, mostly these that are right around Medina Sidonia. So his flagship, the San Martin, Juan Martinez de Recalde's San Juan, the San Marcos, and 2 Portuguese galleons. These 5 ships stood, for a time, more or less alone against the English fleet at dawn on the 8th. We'll get back to them in a second after we discuss one of the first truly major losses incurred by the Armada. The flagship of the galleasses, the San Lorenzo, this is under Hugo de Moncada. She had taken damage to her mast and her rudder during the fireship attack and ended up running aground. And she runs aground basically under the guns of Calais.
Well, that's not good.
Lord Howard sent boats to capture the San Lorenzo, resulting in some hand-to-hand fighting in which Moncada, the Spanish commander, was killed.
I realize you have to probably do the hand-to-hand fighting thing, but also at that point, what are you individually going to do?
I feel like at that point, they're really just fighting for pride.
Or just assuming that you're probably going to it's going to only be worse if you get captured.
Probably. So despite that fight being between the English and the Spanish, like we said, the San Lorenzo runs aground right at Calais. So this is on their land. They say, hey, might as well go claim this. So a French party came aboard and they chased the English off. Seems like the English had already taken care of any Spaniards still on board. So even though disappointing to lose out on the spoils of the San Lorenzo, taking a galleass out of action was a pretty significant development.
Yeah, I feel like that's a win.
So while the San Lorenzo is making her last stand, Medina Sidonia is reforming the Spanish fleet for another fight. This whole thing here, this engagement sometimes referred to as the Battle of Gravelines, after a nearby port.
The Battle of Gravelines?
Gravelines. And it would last for about 9 hours. So throughout this fight, the Spanish are trying to stay as close to Dunkirk as possible, while the English try to push them further out to sea or into the shoals off the Flemish coast. Along with the natural hazards of the area, there's also Justin of Nassau's Dutch ships waiting to pounce. So a major difference between this engagement and the previous ones was the distances involved, described in some accounts as being within hailing distance. If you can shout to people during this battle, you're really close.
Right.
The English captain William Winter on the Vanguard wrote,
"In the continued assaults which we gave on them without entering, we made them feel our ordnance, and if any ship was beaten out of their fleet, she was surrounded and suddenly separated from the rest."
So here's the lions suddenly getting their prey from last episode. So unlike those previous fights, some Spanish vessels actually did begin to take some serious damage. One of these was Medina Sidonia's San Martin. She was reportedly struck more than 200 times, some of those dangerously near the waterline, and she was only saved through the efforts of divers patching her hull.
Wow, it's also crazy to think that that's a thing at this time. Can you imagine being a diver in this time period?
Well, a diver also in the middle of a sea battle seems not great.
Right.
I assume a diver at this point is just a guy who can hold his breath.
I would think, but there might be some surprising stuff.
The Portuguese sister galleons San Mateo and San Felipe, they both took severe enough damage that they ran aground and were captured by the Dutch the following morning. The only Spanish ship to actually sink during this fighting was the Maria Juan out of the Biscayan squadron. She apparently sank while she was in the middle of negotiating the surrender, and only a single boat of survivors made it off.
Trying to give up and still can't get it done.
That kind of shows that a lot of these ships can take a ton of damage, but these wooden sailing vessels, it takes a lot to sink one of these, actually.
Yeah, I feel like that's the thing. Even if you're putting holes in the side of it, that doesn't really matter as far as the ship not sinking.
Yeah, you've got to be hitting it just right to really get it to take on water. So from Martin and Parker here.
Human casualties aboard many of the ships were also high. No more than 127 men of the 457 who had embarked at Lisbon on the San Felipe ever came ashore again. And the death toll aboard the San Mateo was scarcely lower. The Armada's overall casualties that day were probably over 1,000 killed and 800 wounded. But the fighting spirit of the survivors remained strong. At one stage in the battle, a great Italian ship was observed to be running with blood with her main guns dismounted, though she was still to be seen at her station in the defensive rearguard 3 hours later.
So talked about the human casualties for the Spanish being pretty significant here. And the only individual for sure documented casualty is usually this one English guy who jumps on board the deck of one of the Spanish galleons and says something to the tune of, "We've got you now, you might as well surrender." And then he just gets shot in the face. So yeah, there were some English casualties, but not a lot. So by the late afternoon, the action had died down. English are again running low on ammunition, and the Spanish were no longer able to hold out any hope of connecting with Parma. a lot of those Spanish ships would have had no way to stop even if they wanted to, because they don't have their anchors anymore. And this is going to highlight something when they get off the very rocky coast of Ireland in the next episode. If you don't have an anchor, that's going to make things challenging. So this is actually one of the interesting things with the, where was the success of the English fleet? And this fire ship attack's interesting because none of the fire ships strike another Spanish ship and successfully light them on fire.
Right.
They all just ground on the beach and nothing really comes of that. But the effective thing they're able to do is scattering the fleet. That's the Armada's strength, is its cohesion, and now that's broken.
Yeah, you can see that the English kind of have a plan, and they pretty much execute that plan and make the Spanish do what they want them to do.
Yeah, the fire ships don't have to hit anything, as long as they can get them to break apart. So the Armada at this point's got no choice but just to let the wind carry them north, away from those English guns, and also away from any chance of completing their objective.
We saw ourselves lost or taken by the enemy, or the whole Armada drowned upon the banks. It was the most fearful day in the world, for the whole company had lost all hope of success and looked only for death.
If you're reading a more general history, like an English history book or something that happens to mention the Armada, this is often where the story ends.
Yeah, I feel like the fire ships is kind of like the one detail I could have told you about. And that's how the English won.
Now the Armada is scattered. The English won. Everybody goes home, and that's the end of the story. But, still, you have an enormous bulk of this Armada that still has to try to get home.
Right.
So for a podcast that mostly discusses shipwrecks, we are just getting to the best part in episode 4. So in episode 4, we're going to see the Armada go up around Scotland, around Ireland, and try to loop back home for Spain. So if you've been waiting for the shipwrecks here, you are going to get the shipwrecks wall to wall in our next episode, which will be the final main episode of this. And then we will be recording a bonus episode that'll cover some counterfactuals, some what ifs, covering some what else is going on. What are the English doing throughout all of this? What are some of the diplomatic things going on? So it'll be a fun time for everyone as we near the end of this pretty enormous undertaking. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
No, I don't think so. This has been a good series. I've learned a lot so far, and I'm looking forward to kind of getting into that final episode and taking a deeper dive into some of the stuff that I guess what you call the B-sides and rarities of the Spanish Armada.
So with that, let's sign off here, and we will just talk to you next week with another episode.